Why didn't we see COVID-19 coming until it was too late? Why journalists and pundits kept repeating that it wasn't something we needed to really worry about and that the flu was worse? Why is COVID-19 spreading so fast now and yet we didn't perceive that same wildfire speed at the beginning?
Hello, the answer to all these questions is a thing called exponential growth, and in today's video we are going to see what that concept really means. First, I will start by telling you a quick visualization story that will allow you to mentally see what exponential growth is. After that, I will tell you how this freak form of growth applies to our current coronavirus crisis. We humans struggle to grasp the real meaning of exponential growth. Of course, we are familiar with phrases like "it grew exponentially" or like "wow, it's exponential." And we associate these phrases with things that grow very fast. But that's not the true meaning of exponential. Today we'll see what the true meaning of exponential really is. Also, there is an extra advantage to fully understanding the concept of the exponential function, because that function also applies to many other areas of our daily lives. Like, for example, wealth building, or for many of us, the lack of wealth building. So by fully understanding this concept, you can also better understand why you are or are not getting wealthy. By the way, I just said exponential function, but what is the difference between exponential growth and the exponential function? There is no difference. The exponential function is just the mathematical way of representing exponential growth. So in everyday language or in the news, you will find both of them used interchangeably, and that's correct. But before anything else, why do we struggle so much with the concept of exponential growth? The reason is simple. Our brains are just not wired to understand it. Our default factory settings are just not made for getting how exponential growth works.
You have to realize that our brains were formed over 100,000 years ago and that they were optimized to work in an environment that was totally different from our current cities and towns. It wasn't an interconnected high-tech society like ours. It was a world of wild nature and small communities of people that subsisted by hunting and gathering.
And that particular type of environment didn't require exponential thinking for a human to survive or thrive in it. It required linear thinking. So we've stumbled upon a new concept, linear thinking. What is linear thinking? Linear thinking is just a fancy word for the type of intuition that allows us to understand the growth we face in our daily lives. It's that type of natural growth that we can normally encounter in a macroscopic natural environment. And that's why it was the only type of growth that our prehistoric forebears really needed to deal with. Let's see just one quick example of linear thinking.
Take a prehistoric man or woman who is migrating through an extensive region in search for better food sources. That human will learn by experience and intuition that if they walk for a whole day, they can cover about 20 miles. Not that they can count those miles exactly as we can today and give them a specific figure, but that prehistoric person can get the feel for covering 20 miles, and also intuitively, they can easily grasp that if they keep walking every day, the distance they cover will increase by that same amount of miles after every day of walking.
So that the total distance they cover will be 20 miles at the end of the first day, 40 at the end of the second, 60 on the third, 80 on the fourth, and so on. That type of easy to understand growth is what we call linear thinking. But then the world changed. Our brains didn't change, but the world around us did. Paleontologists know that the brain of a person living in 2020 is almost identical to the brain of our ancestors living in the African savanna 100,000 years ago. However, while our brains have stayed the same, the world around us is extremely different from the wild savanna. That's why we need new mental tools to understand things such as wealth building or the way in which a virus spreads throughout an interconnected society. But these mental skills don't come with the factory settings we have. So we need to upgrade our software by studying mathematics, boring, or by listening to a simple visualization story. That sounds better? I'll tell you that story.
There was this wealthy medieval king who one day woke up feeling generous and wanted to do some charity. So as charitable wealthy people do in those cases, he decided to throw a big lavish party in the throne room of his palace, to which he invited all of his court. Then, in the middle of the party, after the king and his guests had wine and dined and laughed and danced, the king asked for a beggar to be brought into their presence. And so a beggar was brought into the throne room.
"Beggar,
The king said,
I am a most generous man, and I want for all these people gathered here to see how generous I am. So ask me for anything in my palace, and it will be yours, and you won't be a poor beggar anymore."
The beggar started to think, and then looked around the throne room as if looking for the best thing to take home with him. The king spoke again.
"You can have any jewel in my palace, or my gold throne, or my gemstone-studded crown. Take anything you want."
The beggar looked around the throne room once more, but after a moment turned to the king and said, "I don't want anything in your palace, I just want rice." The king snorted,
"Rice!"
and then laughed.
He wants rice!
Then, getting serious,
"Just no more, beggar. Tell me what you truly want."
but the beggar insisted that he wasn't in jest, he just wanted rice. And the king, bewildered by the humble request, said,
"Why, so you are in earnest? How much rice do you want then?"
At this, the beggar pointed at a small table next to the throne. On it was a game of chess with its figures and its board. "See that chessboard?" the beggar said. "I'll be counting with 1 grain of rice for the first square on your chessboard, and then double that amount for each of the 64 squares on it. So on the first square there's 1 rice grain, and on the second 2 rice grain, and on the third 4, and on the fourth 8, and on the fifth 16, and on the..."
"Understood.
The king cut off the beggar.
You don't need to tell me what goes on every square. I'm not an illiterate king. I can count."
Then turning to his courtiers, the king said,
"You have all heard the beggar. He could have had any jewel in my palace, but his gluttony makes him content with a mere heap of rice. But the king is a man of his word, and what the beggar asked, the beggar shall have. Bring rice from my pantry."
And thus the king's servants brought rice into the throne room, and in front of everybody they began to put the rice grains into a sack. 1 rice grain for the first square, 2 for the second, 4 for the third, 8 for the fourth, and so on, so that when the first line of the chessboard was completed, they had to pour 128 grains into the sack. And the king was still laughing at the beggar. But when the second line of the chessboard was completed, the king began to secretly admire the beggar's wits a little, for they had to pour 32,768 grains into the sack.
"Why, you are not as full as you look, beggar. Apparently you are to go home with a lot of rice today. But still you are a fool, because you could have been a rich man. Never mind, not everybody's fit for being a rich man."
But everything sped up in the third line of the chessboard, for when they went through it, the resulting number was 8 million, and there wasn't enough rice grains in the palace kitchens to account for it.
"I have no more rice left in my kitchen, but fortunately I have the largest stores of rice in the kingdom. So let's note the figures down now, and I shall pay you every single grain later."
Indeed, though rather annoyed, the king wasn't too worried. He knew he could afford even hundreds of millions of grains without his fortune suffering too much. However, before they had reached the end of the fourth line, something changed. Horror crept into the king's face as he finally realized what he would owe to the beggar at the end of the chessboard.
The king ordered for the counting to stop, approached the beggar, took off his crown, put it on top of the beggar's head, and walked out of the palace, for that was his crown no more, and that was his palace no more, because he was now a ruined man, as not even all his property could ever pay for the amount of rice he owed the beggar. The king was now beggar, and the beggar was king. So, are you curious how much rice went onto the last square of the chessboard? Well, actually, we don't have a word in everyday English to name such a fantastically large number. So, I will show it down here instead. As you can see, it's well above 1 billion. It's well above 1 trillion. It's an amount larger than all the rice that exists not only in a whole country but in the whole world. And it only required 8 rows of a chessboard. it only required 64 squares. That's the might of exponential growth. So we are like the king. And even many of our health officials and doctors, unless they have a very strong background in epidemiology or mathematics, are also like the king. We think we understand exponential growth, but we don't really understand it. Exponential growth is not always fast. Exponential growth is slow, and only after a few turns does it become fast. For example, imagine you could fold a piece of paper as many times as you wanted. The paper is not even 1 millimeter thick. And you fold it once and it's still not even 1 millimeter thick. Now take the Empire State Building in New York. How many times do you think you need to fold that same paper before it becomes as tall as the Empire State Building? The answer? 25 times. Crazily counterintuitive, isn't it? You just need to fold a regular piece of paper 25 times and it becomes as tall as the Empire State Building. It sounds like magic, but it's just the power of the exponential function. If you don't believe me, try it at home. Try to fold one piece of paper, for example, one big newspaper sheet, just 25 times and see what happens. I guarantee you that you are in for a big surprise. After you've done it, please write a comment down below letting me know what happened. So when we see something that starts small, like for example, folding a piece of paper a couple of times, our silly caveman brain think that it will be forever slow, that the growth will be linear. Same with COVID-19 cases. For weeks, they would grow so slowly. One case 1 week, the next week 2, the next week 4. So we thought, there they are again, scaremongering us. How on earth can these crazy epidemiologists be advising us to shut down our entire countries for something that is affecting so few people? Like the smug king at the first line of the chessboard, we humans at the beginning of a pandemic think that we are understanding the pattern of growth and that it will be as manageable in the near future as it is at the beginning. Only when then, just a few weeks later, we get to the fast part of the exponential function and hospitals begin to be swamped all at once with critical ill people is when we realize that action needs to be taken, and then it is too late. Because according to the World Health Organization, the number of COVID-19 cases, when left unmanaged, double every week. That means that the pattern of growth of COVID-19 was exactly the same as the rice grain or the folding paper. So doubling amounts of rice, folding pieces of paper, or the increase in COVID-19 cases are all exponential phenomena that require exponential thinking to be properly foreseen. I hope this video has helped you visualize once and for all what exponential growth is, and that it will help you to think exponentially from now on. However, our inability to think exponentially is not the only reason why our politicians, our journalists, and our opinion makers didn't see COVID-19 coming. There is a second strange mind glitch that prevented most of us from noticing the massive medical tsunami that was rising right in front of our noses. And that second mind glitch is as fascinating as our inability to think exponentially. But I don't want this video to be overly long, so I will explain that second mind glitch in my next video. Also in a future video, I will go into detail about how some people use the power of the exponential function to become very wealthy. But it's not some magic trick or some miracle method. Actually, around you probably, even if you are not aware of it, there are people using this same method. It's something totally scientific and yet as counterintuitive and magical seeming as the folding paper that reaches the height of the Empire State Building. So if you are not too put off by my broken English and you want to learn about this and other things related to our understanding of the world, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching and see you next week.